Apple is often praised as a global symbol of innovation, a brand that doesn't just sell electronics, but shapes entire lifestyles. The iPhone, iPad, and MacBook have become cultural icons representing status and creativity in the modern world. But behind this polished image lies a much darker reality, one that Apple has spent years trying to keep out of the spotlight. From shocking labor scandals inside its supply chain to tax avoidance schemes worth billions, from massive privacy controversies to accusations of monopoly power, Apple's story is not just about innovation, it's also about some of the most notorious corporate scandals of our time. And the truth might change the way you look at that sleek device in your hand forever. Behind Apple's sleek devices lies a supply chain that has been repeatedly accused of running on exploitation, and nowhere is this more evident than in the scandal surrounding Foxconn, Apple's largest manufacturing partner. In the late 2000s and early 2010s, shocking stories emerged from Foxconn factories in China, where hundreds of thousands of workers assembled iPhones under grueling conditions. Reports detailed endless shifts that stretched beyond 12 hours, crowded dormitories where workers barely had room to sleep, and an oppressive environment that pushed employees to the brink. The crisis reached international headlines when a wave of suicides shook the Foxconn campuses. Young workers, some barely out of their teens, were reported to have jumped from factory rooftops after being subjected to relentless pressure and robotic work routines. Images of suicide nets being installed around factory buildings became a haunting symbol of what many critics called the human cost of Apple's success. For a company celebrated in the West as a beacon of innovation, these revelations were a devastating blow. Activists, labor rights groups, and journalists accused Apple of turning a blind eye to abuse in order to meet demand for its blockbuster products. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. Consumers in the United States marveled at each new iPhone launch, while workers in Asia were suffering to produce them. Apple promised reforms, but investigations over the years revealed repeated issues: workers forced into excessive overtime, underage labor allegations, and inadequate safety measures. In 2013, an explosion at a factory that polished iPad casings killed several workers, further underscoring the dangers of Apple's supply chain. The scandal also sparked wider debates in America. Was Apple a company that prided itself on its sleek branding and think different philosophy, any different from the sweatshop-driven industries it claimed to outgrow? In response, Apple invited the Fair Labor Association to audit its factories, released supplier responsibility reports, and pledged improvements. Yet critics argued these moves were more about managing public relations than addressing systemic exploitation. Each year, new reports trickled in, showing conditions had improved only slightly, while profits continued to skyrocket. Perhaps most damaging was how this scandal began reshaping Apple's image in the eyes of American consumers. While many still rushed to line up outside Apple stores, others began asking harder questions. Could they justify paying top dollar for devices made in conditions that drove workers to despair? Could Apple remain a cultural icon while facing accusations of hypocrisy and exploitation? These questions marked the beginning of a long pattern where every dazzling Apple keynote presentation was increasingly shadowed by the scandals behind the curtain. When the conversation shifts from Apple's factories to its finances, another scandal comes into focus, one that exposed how the world's most valuable company managed to avoid paying billions in taxes. For years, Apple maintained a pristine public image, presenting itself as a company rooted in American ideals of innovation and entrepreneurship. But in 2013, a U.S. Senate investigation revealed something very different. Apple had built one of the most elaborate tax avoidance structures in corporate history, using Ireland as its financial safe haven. The revelations were staggering. Apple was accused of channeling profits through subsidiaries in Ireland that had no tax residency anywhere in the world. These so-called stateless companies paid little to no tax on tens of billions of dollars in earnings. The Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, led by Senator Carl Levin, called out Apple for creating a holy grail of tax avoidance, effectively designing subsidiaries that existed on paper but claimed to have no legal home. This allowed Apple to shelter massive profits offshore, away from the eyes of the IRS. At the height of this scheme, Apple was paying effective tax rates as low as 2%, far below the corporate rate in the United States. The scandal deepened when the European Commission opened its own investigation. By 2016, the EU concluded that Apple had received illegal state aid from Ireland, granting the company an unfair tax advantage. The ruling was explosive. Apple was ordered to pay back $14.5 billion in unpaid taxes, the largest corporate tax penalty in history. Tim Cook called the ruling political crap, and the Irish government, eager to protect its reputation as a business-friendly hub, sided with Apple in appealing the decision. This strange alliance between one of the world's wealthiest corporations and a small European nation sparked global outrage. To critics, it symbolized how Apple used its power and influence to bend governments to its will. In the United States, the scandal fueled debates about corporate loyalty and fairness. Apple presented itself as an American company through and through, but critics argued it was abandoning its own country when it came to taxes. Lawmakers accused Apple of benefiting from American infrastructure education and innovation ecosystems, while refusing to contribute its fair share back into the system. For ordinary Americans especially, during a period of economic struggle after the 2008 financial crisis, the idea that Apple was sitting on hundreds of billions in offshore profits struck a nerve. Apple defended itself aggressively, insisting that it followed all tax laws and that the problem was with broken systems, not with the company itself. Tim Cook told lawmakers bluntly that Apple paid every dollar it owed. Yet this defense only highlighted the gulf between legality and morality. Just because something was technically legal did not mean it was fair. In many ways, this scandal forced Americans to confront the uncomfortable reality that beloved corporations could exploit loopholes on a scale far beyond anything individuals could imagine. The fallout extended well beyond Apple. Other tech giants, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, were dragged into similar controversies, but Apple's case remained the most iconic. It wasn't just about numbers on a balance sheet. It was about the symbolism of a company worth more than many nations using its resources to avoid supporting the very societies that made its success possible. Critics asked, how could Apple claim to think different when its tax strategies looked like every other giant corporation clinging to offshore havens? Even after years of litigation, appeals, and political debates, the scandal left a permanent mark on Apple's reputation. While customers still flocked to buy iPhones, the narrative that Apple was both a design leader and a tax dodger lingered. It exposed a paradox at the heart of the brand. Apple's sleek minimalism hid not just the circuitry inside its products, but also the sprawling, shadowy structures of a corporate empire built on avoiding accountability. For Americans, the scandal became more than a story about tax codes. It became a story about trust. Could Apple still be seen as a company of visionaries, or was it just another giant playing the same cynical game? If Apple's tax strategies cast doubt on its fairness, its long and complicated history with privacy scandals raised even deeper questions about trust. Apple has long marketed itself as the champion of user privacy, often contrasting itself with competitors like Google and Facebook, who are more openly reliant on advertising and data harvesting. The company's slogans, What happens on your iPhone stays on your iPhone became a rallying cry for customers who valued security. But reality has not always lived up to the promise, and over the years, Apple has been pulled into a series of scandals that revealed just how fragile that image really was. One of the most notorious moments came in 2014, when hackers breached Apple's iCloud service and leaked thousands of private photos of celebrities online. The Celebgate scandal dominated global headlines, and while Apple insisted that the leaks were due to weak individual passwords rather than a failure of its systems, critics saw it differently. To them, the incident exposed vulnerabilities in a service Apple had marketed as safe and secure. The damage was not just technical, it was deeply personal. Customers were forced to question whether their most intimate information was really safe in Apple's hands. Even as Apple scrambled to strengthen its security and improve two-factor authentication, the idea that the cloud is never truly safe lingered, tainting the brand's carefully cultivated reputation. Another turning point arrived in 2016 during Apple's high-profile standoff with the FBI. After the San Bernardino terrorist attack, federal investigators demanded that Apple unlock an iPhone used by one of the shooters. Apple refused, arguing that creating a backdoor would compromise the privacy of millions of users worldwide. The case exploded into a national debate about security versus privacy, with lawmakers, law enforcement, and tech experts weighing in. Tim Cook called the demand dangerous and unprecedented, framing Apple as the protector of civil liberties. While many Americans supported Apple's stance, others saw it as arrogance, placing corporate image above national security. The controversy highlighted a profound dilemma: could Apple simultaneously be a guardian of privacy and a responsible global citizen? As years passed, new revelations chipped away at Apple's clean narrative. In 2019, it was revealed that contractors working with Apple were regularly listening to snippets of Siri recordings, including private conversations that users never intended to share. The company had quietly allowed human reviewers to grade voice assistant accuracy, but customers were shocked to learn that sensitive audio, sometimes including intimate or confidential moments, had been overheard by strangers. Apple apologized and promised reforms, but the scandal deepened suspicions that the company's privacy-first marketing was more about branding than reality. The problems did not end there. Reports also surfaced that Apple devices collected extensive location and behavioral data, often buried deep within settings and difficult for ordinary users to fully disable. In Europe and the United States, regulators accused Apple of hypocrisy. While it blocked third-party apps from aggressive tracking on iPhones, it continued to build its own ad network, leveraging user data under the guise of privacy protection. To critics, this looked less like a moral stand and more like a monopoly move, cutting competitors off from data while keeping a privileged channel open for itself. The tension between Apple's words and actions resonated strongly with American consumers. On the one hand, millions felt safer entrusting their digital lives to Apple rather than to companies with weaker reputations. On the other, each scandal added cracks to that trust, reminding people that even the most sophisticated systems could be exploited. Was Apple truly protecting privacy, or was it simply selling the idea of privacy as another premium feature? By the early 2020s, Apple's privacy battles had become central to its identity. Congressional hearings, lawsuits, and watchdog reports all drew attention to the same contradiction. The company that promised to be different was still deeply entangled in the same messy debates about surveillance data collection and transparency. To many Americans, Apple's privacy scandals did not just tarnish the brand, they forced a re-evaluation of the entire tech industry. If even Apple could not be trusted, who could? While Apple struggled to defend its privacy record, another scandal was brewing, one that threatened the very foundation of its business model. At the heart of it was the App Store, Apple's tightly controlled marketplace that became both its greatest strength and its biggest liability. For years, Apple portrayed the App Store as a safe, curated environment where users could trust every app they downloaded. But developers increasingly accused Apple of something else entirely, running a monopoly. The most explosive chapter came in 2020, when Epic Games, the company behind Fortnite, directly challenged Apple's rules. Epic introduced its own payment system inside Fortnite to bypass Apple's mandatory 30% commission on in-app purchases. Apple responded swiftly by banning Fortnite from the App Store, igniting a lawsuit that would expose the inner workings of one of the most lucrative ecosystems in the tech industry. In court, Epic accused Apple of abusing its dominance to squeeze developers and stifle competition. Apple, in turn, argued that its closed ecosystem was necessary to maintain security and protect users. The trial was closely followed across the United States, turning what might have been a developer dispute into a cultural battle about fairness, choice, and the power of big tech. The Epic case was not an isolated incident. Developers of all sizes complained that Apple's rules were arbitrary, its review process opaque, and its fees excessive. Music streaming giant Spotify filed antitrust complaints in Europe, accusing Apple of using the App Store to give Apple Music an unfair advantage. Smaller developers shared stories of apps being rejected for vague reasons, only to later see Apple introduce a suspiciously similar feature in its own apps. To critics, this was not just business as usual, it was Apple leveraging its control to crush rivals before they could grow. Regulators took notice. In the United States, Congress summoned Apple executives to testify as part of a broader investigation into big tech monopolies. Lawmakers grilled Tim Cook on whether Apple's control of the App Store hurt innovation and harmed consumers. The hearings painted a picture of a company that, despite its sleek image, was using its dominance in ways that echoed the old monopolies of American history, from railroads to oil barons. In Europe, regulators went even further, pushing new rules that could force Apple to open its ecosystem to competitors and alternative app stores. For a company that built its brand on control and simplicity, the possibility of losing that control was nothing short of existential. The controversy struck a particularly deep chord with American consumers. Many had grown up seeing Apple as the underdog, the creative alternative to Microsoft's dominance in the 1990s. Now, Apple was the one accused of wielding power to suppress competition. The irony was hard to miss. Could the company that once inspired rebellion with its famous 1984 ad have become the very big brother it warned against? Apple tried to soften the blow with small concessions, such as lowering its commission to 15% for smaller developers and allowing some apps to link to outside payment options. But critics called these changes cosmetic, designed to calm regulators without addressing the core issue. The lawsuits, investigations, and public scrutiny continued, keeping the App Store controversy alive in headlines year after year. For Apple, this scandal was about more than money. It was about its identity. The App Store was supposed to embody Apple's values of safety, trust, and innovation. Instead, it became a symbol of greed and gatekeeping, raising uncomfortable questions about whether Apple had traded its soul for profit. To millions of Americans watching the court battles unfold, the message was clear. Apple was no longer just the maker of beloved gadgets. It was a corporate giant fighting tooth and nail to defend a system that critics said exploited both developers and consumers. As Apple fought accusations of monopoly power, another scandal simmered in the background, one tied to its environmental image. For years, Apple has presented itself as a leader in sustainability, highlighting recycled materials in its products, energy-efficient factories, and bold promises to reach carbon neutrality. Slick keynote videos showed wind turbines, solar panels, and recycled aluminum carefully crafted to convince consumers that every iPhone purchase was a step toward a greener planet. But critics began to argue that much of this was greenwashing marketing designed to make Apple look environmentally responsible while masking practices that were far less admirable. The most controversial moment came in 2020 when Apple announced it would no longer include a charger in the box with new iPhones. The company claimed the move would reduce electronic waste and help protect the environment, estimating that removing chargers would save millions of tons of carbon emissions. On the surface, it seemed like a bold, eco-friendly step. But consumers quickly noticed that buying a charger separately cost extra, leading many to accuse Apple of disguising a profit-driven decision as environmental responsibility. Lawsuits were filed in countries like Brazil, where regulators argued that Apple was simply shifting costs onto customers while pocketing billions in savings. For many, the no-charger policy became a symbol of how Apple's environmental narrative didn't always match reality. Digging deeper, watchdog organizations pointed out other contradictions. Apple's annual sustainability reports touted progress, but critics noted that the company relied heavily on carbon offsets rather than actual reductions in emissions. Reports also highlighted that while Apple promoted recycling programs, the company made it notoriously difficult for independent repair shops and consumers to fix their own devices. The right to repair movement accused Apple of designing products to be nearly impossible to open or upgrade, pushing consumers to buy new devices rather than extend the life of old ones. To activists, this was the opposite of sustainability. It was planned obsolescence hidden under a green label. The environmental controversies went beyond products. Apple's supply chain, the same network already criticized for labor abuses, was also responsible for massive environmental damage in Asia. Factories supplying Apple were accused of polluting rivers, overusing resources, and violating environmental standards in pursuit of Apple's aggressive production targets. While Apple claimed to enforce strict rules on suppliers, investigative reports suggested enforcement was inconsistent at best. Once again, the contrast was jarring, glossy marketing about green energy. On one hand, harsh realities of pollution and waste on the other. In the United States, the debate became personal. Apple's branding had long connected with consumers on an emotional level, but scandals like the charger controversy forced many Americans to confront whether they were buying into an illusion. Was the iPhone in their pocket truly part of a greener future, or just another disposable gadget dressed up with eco-friendly buzzwords? For a company that prided itself on trust, these questions cut deep. Apple, of course, defended its record. Executives pointed to billions invested in renewable energy supplier cleanup programs and ambitious climate pledges. The company promised to be carbon neutral across its entire supply chain by 2030. Yet skepticism remained. Environmental groups warned that Apple's glossy reports left out key details, while consumer advocates argued that genuine sustainability required more than flashy announcements. It required empowering people to keep their devices longer and reducing the churn of constant upgrades. Ultimately, Apple's environmental scandals revealed another paradox at the heart of the brand. The same company that inspired global admiration for its sleek design and forward-thinking technology was also accused of manipulating public perception with half-truths about its impact on the planet. For many Americans, this wasn't just a story about chargers or carbon pledges. It was a reminder that even the most beloved companies could exploit environmental ideals to serve the bottom line. And as climate change became one of the defining issues of the 21st century, Apple's ability or inability to live up to its promises would define not just its reputation, but its legacy. Apple's story is one of brilliance and contradiction. On the surface, it remains the world's most admired technology company, celebrated for devices that have changed how we communicate, work, and live. But as we've seen behind the sleek glass and aluminum, are scandals that reveal a far more complicated reality: factories where workers suffered financial maneuvers that dodged billions in taxes, privacy promises that didn't always hold, monopolistic practices that stifled competition, and an environmental narrative that critics say is more marketing than substance. Each scandal chips away at the myth of perfection that Apple has built for decades. And yet, Apple endures. Every year, millions still line up to buy its latest devices. That's the paradox. Apple has become so deeply woven into our lives that even when its scandals are exposed, its influence remains unshaken. Perhaps it speaks to the power of branding, or perhaps it's a reflection of us, the consumers willing to overlook ethical questions in exchange for convenience, design, and status. In the end, the scandals of Apple force us to confront a bigger question: can a company this powerful ever truly be held accountable? Or has Apple become too essential to fail, too embedded in our culture to face consequences? The answer may say more about us than about Apple itself. If you found this story eye-opening, stay with us, because the deeper we dig into the world's biggest companies, the more we uncover the scandals they don't want you to know. Subscribe for more stories from Almost Bankrupt, where we reveal the hidden truths behind the giants that shape our world.